Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants Hangout. My name is Joe Grabowski, and I will be your host for today. If you've been following along this month, you know that we have been diving deep into the issue of climate change. We've been talking to different climate scientists and explorers from all over the world and learning not only about what's happening and the impact it's having on our planet, but also some of the innovative solutions that people are coming up with to tackle this important issue. So really excited for today's event. Today we are hanging out with Ambassador Fuller. Ambassador Fuller advises both the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change and the Minister of Foreign Affairs on how Canada can best advance its climate change priorities on the world stage and work closely with Canadian missions to put the Government of Canada's environmental policies into practice. So she reinforces Canada's work with other countries on innovative climate solutions and promotes our clean technology sector to global investors. So earlier in her career, the ambassador worked at Natural Resources Canada, where she headed the Office of Energy Efficiency and contributed to the development of the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. She's also served abroad as Ambassador of Canada and Uruguay from 2004 to 2007, and Ambassador to Chile from 2012 to 2015. So Ambassador, it is such a pleasure to have you joining us today. We've got a great group of classrooms joining us from different locations around Canada. We're excited to get to know you a little bit. And of course, we're going to have a little Q&A action towards the end.
All right. Thank you so much, Joe. It's so great to have this opportunity to speak to all of these classrooms and all at once. And it's especially nice for me to have the chance to speak to some of you I know are in high school, like my kids. My kids are in grade 9 and grade 12. And, you know, because of my job, I travel so much. It's kind of tough because I have to leave them alone with their dad, but they don't mind because I'm not around to bug them about cleaning up their room and doing their homework. So that's okay. But Joe already told you a little bit about me, and maybe I can just start off by explaining. Sometimes people ask me, what is an ambassador for climate change? We know what is an ambassador to another country. Like Joe mentioned, I was ambassador to Chile before. So how is it different to be an ambassador for climate change? Well, first of all, I didn't have to move out of Ottawa. So I'm in the National Capital Region. Let me just show you here where I am. I'm going to just show you a little picture of where we're located here. This is the view. You see that now? This is the view from across the river from my office. So I'm on the Gatineau side of the Ottawa River. And you can see the Parliament buildings right there. So instead of looking after the relationship with another country, I look after our relationship with other countries on climate change. And really, it's about building partnerships because climate change is a really urgent problem. And we're not going to solve it unless we work together. There is no one country that can solve the problem of climate change. It takes partnerships. And so my job as ambassador for climate change is to build partnerships with other countries that can really help to reduce our emissions and solve this problem. And we know that this is a problem that Canadians are already seeing in their daily lives. We know that, for example, we had some pretty significant heat waves in the last couple of years. We've had some big flooding events, and we know that the warmer the atmosphere is, the more rain it holds, so we're going to get more flooding. We've had some pretty severe forest fires, and we know that when the atmosphere is hotter, there's going to be more forest fires. And also in the north, we have melting sea ice and melting permafrost. So we know that all those effects are going to get more serious. So we really have to form partnerships with other countries. And so again, I'm going to show you another little picture here of what goes on when we go abroad. So this is me in Poland last December. We were discussing what we've done so far to meet our commitments to the Paris Agreement. So in this picture,
I'm going to pause you for just a moment. I think the screen share didn't go. Do you want to try and click one more time?
Oh, okay. Sorry.
That's okay.
Let me, Okay, there we go.
There we go. It's coming now.
Okay. Oh no, no, no. Oh no. Get a little more practice on this. Can you see it now?
We got it.
Okay, so here I'm speaking to, this is a gathering of all the countries that are part of the Paris Agreement. And I'm speaking to them about what we're doing to implement our commitments under the Paris Agreement. So maybe I can just ask you, show me your hands. Who's heard of the Paris Agreement in your classrooms? Maybe you can just put your hands up if you've heard of the Paris Agreement. All right, well, let me tell you what it is. In the Paris Agreement, which we negotiated a couple of years ago, all countries agreed to take on a commitment to reduce their emissions. So it's really important that Canada meet our commitment to reducing emissions, and it's really important that we work with other countries to help them meet their commitment to reducing emissions. So it's a critical international agreement that is really good to have in place, because without that, we couldn't work together with other nations around the world. And there's almost 200 countries in the Paris Agreement. So it's not easy to get that many countries to agree on something, but we were able to agree on this commitment to all reduce our emissions. So that's a really important piece. So what else do we do? Well, we are also working with other countries on the challenge of phasing out burning coal for electricity. So you know your electricity that comes into your house, it has to come from somewhere, right? Sometimes it comes from hydroelectricity, which is clean, it doesn't create emissions. Sometimes it comes from natural gas, which is pretty good. But sometimes in some parts of Canada, it still comes from coal. And in Ontario, those of you who are in Ontario has already ended the use of coal for generating electricity. And that's really great, because now in Ontario, we have better air quality than we used to have. We've gone from having 50 bad air days a year to zero, essentially. So that's really good. And what we want to do is help other countries to do the same thing. So we formed this alliance. It's called the Powering Past Coal Alliance. It started with 20 countries or 20 members, and now it's got 80 members. So again, I'm going to show you a picture. Hope I'm going to do it right this time. And share, okay. And let me see if I can find the picture. Yeah, so here. So this is the room we had in, again, it was at the conference in Poland. You can see the room is full of people. It was standing room only. These were all people who were coming to hear about the work of the Powering Past Coal Alliance. So this was led by Minister McKenna and by her British counterpart. We're leading this with the United Kingdom. And what we're doing is sharing with these countries how we're doing this work of phasing out coal, so that they can do that too. And that's a really good way to show leadership internationally. So am I back on the screen? Did I do that right this time? Great.
You got you back.
So then the other part of my work, and Joe referred to this also, is to promote Canadian clean technology. And this is where climate change is a really great opportunity for Canada. It's a really great opportunity for our companies to be able to share the technologies that they're developing that make our economy cleaner. So this can be all sorts of things, from clean energy to lower emission agriculture to energy efficient buildings. So bear with me. Again, I'm going to show you another picture. So, oops, I'm not getting the share. Oh, is this working? You seeing that?
Try and hit it one more time. It didn't go through.
Oh, why isn't it sharing? Okay, yeah, there we go. Sorry about this, kids. So there, you should see, it's not full screen, sorry about that, but you can see me and a gentleman whose name is Mark Bedard standing beside a school bus. Well, that school bus is made in Quebec and it's electric. And this company called Lion Electric is selling these school buses all over the United States as well as in Canada. And how great is that? These are school buses that don't create greenhouse gas emissions. And when you line up for the school bus beside this bus, you're not going to be breathing in anything that's bad for you. This is a really great innovation. And there's all kinds of Canadian companies that are inventing all kinds of really cool things that can help to solve this problem. So I'm going to show you one more picture, and this is going to be of someone who is just started out just like you guys in high school. Oh, I've lost her. Oh no, where's Miranda? Yeah, we've lost Miranda. There she is. Okay. So Miranda Wang, she went to high school in BC, and in her science class, she started thinking about the problem of plastics and how do you recycle plastics. So she was working in her science class with her teacher around chemical methods to break down plastics and make it easier to recycle. And now she's running a company in the United States called Biosolation. So that just shows you the kind of great innovation that can really even start in high school. And why is plastics important? Well, plastics, when we create them, that uses a lot of energy, and plastics come from petroleum. So if we can recycle them, that saves a lot of emissions. So that's why Miranda was named a champion of the earth. And you can see there in the background of where I'm standing with her. This was in New York. She was named one of the young champions of the earth. So I thought that was really neat. So, so I'm going to just show you one more thing. And this is not a picture, but this is, am I back here? No. Yes? You seeing me now, Joe?
Yeah, you're back.
Okay, great. So I just wanted to show you one more thing. And this is this pin, which when I was in Washington last week, I attended a meeting. It's called the Vulnerable 20. So these are countries in the world that are really vulnerable to climate change. They asked us to wear this pin to the meeting. And it's made of seeds that come from the Pacific Islands. And the Pacific Islands, they know that if we don't solve the problem of climate change, their islands won't exist anymore. The sea level will rise to the point where some of those islands will just be underwater. So think, you know, when I reflect on what I'm doing in my daily work, I have to think about this and how these countries are relying on Canada and other countries that are richer than they are to show leadership on climate change, to move ahead with reducing our own greenhouse gas emissions, and also to help those countries in building their resilience to climate change. So that's a really important challenge. It brings really great opportunities for Canadian innovators as well, innovators that can be people like you who have great ideas. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from you and answering any questions you might have or anything you might want to say about how you think we can address the problem of climate change.
All right. Well, Ambassador Fuller, thank you so much for sharing with us. That was great. It's great to hear some of the initiatives that Canada is taking part in. And, you know, I have to say, you just learned how to do that screen share before the call. You did an excellent job. That was awesome. So thank you so much for sharing those images with us. As we do get started, I want to give a couple quick shout outs. So I want to give a quick shout out to any classrooms who are tuning in on YouTube today. Use the chat sidebar. Let us know where you're viewing from and send in a question or two, and I'll make sure that they get mixed into our questions. I also want to give a shout out to Environment and Climate Change Canada. With their support, we've been able to do all these events this month based around climate change. So a huge shout out to them as well. And Ambassador, I'm so glad you brought up those island nations in the Pacific. We do have some events coming up later in the month with focusing on Kiribati in the U.S. Marshall Islands. So you know, it's a story that isn't heard a lot. Is some of these beautiful places in the Pacific who have contributed very little to climate change are some of the first who are feeling some of the biggest effects. So thank you so much for sharing that and bringing that to the students today. All right, well, let's get meeting some classrooms. So let's start off. We're gonna go to Mrs. Mercier. She is got some grade 5s hanging out with her in Calgary, Alberta. Let me get their microphone turned on. How we doing, Calgary, Alberta?
Good. Do you have an Xbox One?
All right, who's up with a question?
When did climate change start to be noticed?
Oh, well, that's a really good question. You know, it's one of these things where It's starting very gradually. And when we have what we call an extreme weather event, like a really long heat wave, it's hard for scientists to say that particular event is because of climate change. What scientists do know is that those kinds of events will become more frequent. So I think it's fair to say that in the last, probably the last 10 years or so, we've been seeing more of these frequent types of events. So we're going to see these types of things happen more and more frequently.
Yeah, and I think it's an important thing to think about too with the Canadian Arctic, that our polar regions are warming faster than anywhere else on the planet. So it's definitely something that's having an impact, not only on the planet, but especially where we live here in Canada. All right, well, let's meet another classroom. Let's take a trip now. Let's go to Brucefield, Ontario this time. Mrs. Henderson's group are hanging out with us. We've got some grade 6, 7s in her classroom. Let's get their microphone turned on. How we doing, Brucefield? All right, who's up with a question?
Do you think climate change will ever end, or do you think it will be an issue that every generation faces?
Okay, well, you know, that really depends on what we do now. That really depends upon whether we move ahead with actions to reduce emissions and get ahead of this problem. And in that scenario, if we can do that, then future generations are going to have a much healthier planet and they're going to be much better off. If we don't do that, if we don't succeed in reducing emissions, then future generations are going to live in some pretty tough conditions. If you think about what the planet would be like if it's several degrees warmer than it is now, that might not sound like a lot, like 2, 3, 4 degrees. That makes a big difference in the kinds of things I was referring to earlier, the frequency of heat waves, what it will have in terms of an impact on our food supply, on water, especially in countries that don't have large water supplies. So those future generations could have very difficult lives if we don't take action to take on this problem now.
All right, excellent question and an excellent point. And I know sometimes it seems daunting getting so many people to change and think about our planet in this different way. But the story that I like to think about is years ago when the hole was discovered in the ozone layer over Antarctica in very short order, about 2 years. Countries got together, signed the Montreal Accord, banned CFCs, and we made a huge difference in a short period of time. So I think we can do it again. It's just a matter of getting everybody on board and on the same page. All right, let's go to Canada, Ontario this time. We've got some grade 7s hanging out with Miss Tibshrani. Let me get her microphone turned on. How we doing, Canada? All right, we're ready.
So, how is Canada reducing single use of plastic, and what action are they gonna take?
Okay, so yeah, I said a few words about the importance of plastics for the climate change problem, and again, we've been leading international action on this problem, so getting other countries to focus on it. So when we were president of the G7 last year, we brought into being the Oceans Plastics Charter. And that started with the G7 countries signing on to that. And now there's a whole lot more countries that have signed on to the charter, which commits countries to do the kinds of things that Canada's moving forward to do, which is increase the amount of plastics that are recycled, make sure that plastics are designed in such a way that they can be recycled, reduce the amount of waste that is going to landfills. So these are all the kinds of things that we're working on now in a national plan for action on climate on plastics. And it's going to take the commitment of of all levels of government, so municipalities and provinces, as well as the federal government. But this is going to not only help to clean up our oceans, which are filling up with plastic, but it's also going to help the climate change problem by reducing the amount of emissions that are created by plastics.
All right, excellent. And it's, you know, that must be a really exciting part of your job is being able to see Canada being a role model and help other countries kind of follow along. That must be a fun part of the job, to get to work with so many people from around the world. All right.
It really is. And it's yeah, so sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead. Yeah, sorry. All right. Let's go to Brampton, Ontario. Mrs. Gerdhari's class is joining us. There's some grade 7s in Brampton. Let's get their microphone turned on, see how they're doing today. How are we doing, grade 7s?
Good.
All right, we're ready.
Okay, we recently heard Canada is warming up faster than other countries. How do you see this affecting us in 10 to 15 years?
Yeah. So Canada is warming at twice the global rate of warming, and the north of Canada is warming at 3 times the rate of global warming. So how will that affect us in future years? Well, I should say that if you want to look up your specific location and how that's going to be affected, that's something you can do on the Environment Canada and Climate Change website. You'll find maps that will show the precipitation change and the expected temperature change in your part of the country. But so it can be different for different parts of Canada. But the main kinds of things that we're going to see more of are the kinds of things that I was referring to earlier. So in the summertime, we're going to have longer heat waves. At any time of year, we could have much more extreme rainfall, and we're going to see more frequent forest fires in the areas of the country that are forested. And in the north, where communities rely on ice roads, they're going to see those ice roads melting as the permafrost melts. And they're going to see a reduction, and already are seeing a significant reduction in sea ice. And that has a big impact on wildlife, of course. In fact, wildlife all over the country is going to be affected by this changing climate. And while people can do certain things to insulate themselves from the impact of climate change, for animals and plants, it can be really hard, whether they can move to environments that are going to be more hospitable for them, or whether they're simply going to become more at risk and in some cases eventually extinct. So those are some of the kinds of impacts that we'll see in Canada.
All right. We're going to take a trip now to Raymond, Alberta. We have some grade 6s hanging out with Mrs. Bowles. Let me get their microphone turned on. How are we doing, grade 6s? All right, a nice big group of grade 6s. Who's got a question?
So we were wondering, what made you decide to run for public office?
Well, actually, this isn't a public office in the sense of a elected office. I was named to this position by the Prime Minister, so it's an appointed position. And I'm a public servant. I'm not a political level representative. And I was working before as ambassador to various different countries, and also working in Ottawa on issues like energy and environment. So with that background, combining my experience as ambassador and my experience on environment and energy issues, I was selected to be named to this position. All
right, great question. Let's see, we need to go to another class who's joining us here in Ontario. We're going to go to Mrs. Durnan's group. They're in Clinton, Ontario. We've got some high school students hanging out with us. Let's get their microphone turned on. How are we doing, Clinton?
We're good.
All right, who's up with a question?
That's gonna be me. Guys, quiet. I'm being a nice person. How as teens can we help reduce climate change?
How can you help to reduce climate change? Is that what the question was?
Yep.
Yeah, that's a great question. And there are so many things that you can do as students, and just, all Canadians have so many things they can do. So let's start with our homes, where we live and the energy we use in our homes. So one of the things you can do is look around your house and see, how are you using energy and how could you use less of it? Are you making sure that in the wintertime when the furnace is running, you're not wasting energy, you're not leaving a window open, or is your house well insulated? Is that something, if your parents are thinking about renovating, are they thinking about how to make it more energy efficient? Or if you're buying appliances, buy ones that use the least amount of energy possible. And then the other area of our lives where we generate greenhouse gas emissions is in transportation. That's an important source of emissions. So options like, instead of maybe asking your mom and dad to drive you somewhere, maybe you could take the bus, or maybe you could take your bike or walk. When you have those options, using those options is definitely a great way to reduce emissions. Now, maybe if your parents are thinking about buying a new car, maybe take a look at an electric car. Do the math, how much money you'd save on gas, and there's incentives from various governments for buying electric cars as well. So that can be a fantastic way to reduce emissions as well. And then, there's just in getting engaged and making your voices heard, because, you're the future generation. You're going to be the leaders of tomorrow. You're going to be more impacted by climate change than previous generations. So making your voices heard with governments and talking to them about what are they doing to solve this problem is really important. I think the youth voice is having a really important impact around the world. This year in particular, we've seen more and more of that. And that's really important because it makes it easier for leaders in governments to take the decisions, to take the actions that aren't always easy, but that are going to be necessary if we're going to solve this problem.
All right, excellent. Well, I want to give a quick shout out to our class in Canada. They have to duck out right now, so I'm going to turn their mic on, let them give a big wave. So thanks so much for hanging out with us, boys and girls.
Bye, Canada.
Awesome. Thanks so much for joining us. We're going to swing through some of our classrooms again and give them a chance for a follow-up question. So let's go back to Calgary, Alberta this time, and let's see if they have another question for us. So your microphone is on.
What will happen if we do nothing about it?
Yeah, well, that's a scary question, because in the scenarios that scientists have done that examine what would the world be like if no action is taken and if temperatures continue to rise, then it gets to be pretty scary, because we could see really significant levels of sea level rise. I was mentioning earlier that some islands would literally be underwater, and some cities, some of our cities, think about Halifax or other cities that are coastal, they will have significant problems with rising sea level if we don't act on this problem. Other impacts that I talked about earlier in terms of more severe heat and impact on the food supply, all of those impacts will become much, much more serious if we don't take action.
Yeah, that's such a great question, such an important question, because it seems like sometimes we think that there's so much time, or we think that the planet's so large that how can our actions affect the planet? But we can't think in those terms anymore. We have to really think about what we can do now to start mitigating some of those changes and being prepared. Because as you said, Ambassador, it's going to affect everything from where people can live. There'll be climate refugees who have to move all over the world. There'll be food shortages. The extreme weather is going to cause so many billions and billions of dollars in damage. So it really is a serious issue. So thank you for that question from Calgary, Alberta. Let's see. Let's take a trip now. Let's go back to our class in Brucefield, Ontario with Mrs. Henderson. Let's get your microphone turned on. All right, we're ready.
Do you believe that suburban overpopulation is impacting climate change?
Whether suburban overpopulation is impacting?
Yes, suburban overpopulation.
So if we think about suburbs, if I understand the question, like suburbs which are around our cities, one thing we have to think about in cities is that if they become sprawling and the suburbs just keep growing and growing, then that does mean more energy is used in transportation. So one way to plan cities that are going to be more sustainable is to have more buildings, which are like apartment buildings, and more dense cities that are more compact and take up less land. Because every time we remove green spaces, we also stop the absorption of carbon dioxide by those forests that we're taking away. So there's a lot we can do in the way we plan our cities that can reduce the impact that we have on climate change, as well as making it easier for people to get to work and making sure our cities stay vibrant and healthy and have clean air and all of those kinds of things that we want to have. And Joe, I don't know if you mind, maybe if I can throw out a question, just as we're going back to other classrooms, I'd love to hear from any of you who want to add to the list of things I listed around things that you can do to address climate change, because I'm sure you have some ideas as well, and maybe there's things that you're already doing that help to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I just throw that out there as a question back to all of you.
All right, I think that's definitely a good point. And we'll ask our classroom. So I'm going to show an example here of something that I do, and it may seem small and it's on the issue of the plastics, but what I've started doing is carrying around some utensils. So they're bamboo utensils, anything you can need in there, from a straw to a fork and a spoon. And it's just a way that I don't have to use single-use plastics, that energy isn't used that created them in the first place, and then there isn't that waste. So that's just something really small that I do to try and mitigate some of my footprint. But let's go to our next classroom. Let's go to Mrs. Bowles' class this time. And if you guys have another question, we'll steal the other question. But if you want to put out a thought on something you guys do or could do to help with climate change, we'd love to collect some of those too. So here we go. Mrs. Bowles' class, your microphone's on again.
So something I do to help reduce climate change is use a reusable water bottle instead of the plastic bottles. And a question that we have is, what are other countries doing to help with climate change?
Yeah, what's really encouraging is there's a lot of things that other countries are doing. Like, we've seen quite a few countries say that by 2040, which isn't that far away, that there'll be no more gas-burning vehicles available on their markets. And we've set that as a target as well for Canada. So that's one kind of very important target around how we transition our transportation systems to car fleets that are zero emissions, so that when you drive a car somewhere, you're not creating greenhouse gas emissions. So that'll be a really important change. Other things that other countries are doing is expanding renewable energy, so wind energy and solar energy. This is a really great option for a lot of countries that they're currently, importing oil and gas, and now they're thinking about, if they move to wind and solar energy, then that could be a lot cheaper for them. And the price of these sources of energy is really falling. So a lot of countries are really seeing that as a big opportunity to have cleaner air, cheaper energy, and help solve the climate change problem. And also, going back to talking about the the Canadian companies I was referring to earlier, a lot of countries are really saying that if they are in the lead on this transition to clean technology, that's going to be really good for their economies. You know, when I was in Washington last week, a lot of countries were saying, we want to lead this transition because we know that this is going to really result in great jobs for our citizens, because we know there's going to be a lot of demand for clean technologies and the new kinds of approaches to generating energy or energy efficiency or climate smart agriculture, all of these things that countries are thinking about doing. Those that have those that are in the lead on those new opportunities are really going to do well. So that's where we want to make sure that Canada is really positioned to do well in this transition to a low carbon economy.
Excellent. Awesome. And thank you for the question from Raymond, Alberta, and showing off your reusable bottle. Very important too. And I liked your shirt. It said optimist. And I think that's really important. We hear a lot of negative stories, but it's really good to think about the positive steps that people are taking. So it's good to be optimistic too. So thanks for sharing the shirt and the really cool water bottle. Let's go to back to our high school students in Clinton. If you guys have something to share that you can do to help reduce climate change, but also if you have another question, we'll steal that too.
Okay. So my question is, at the pace that at the rate that we're going with using our resources and whatnot, how long do you think that we have left until everything is used up and gone?
Okay, well, there was a really important report that was put out by all the scientists who work together on climate change. It was put out last fall. You might have heard about it. It's called the IPCC report. And it said that we really have until 2030, which is 11 years from now, to cut our greenhouse gas emissions in half globally. And then it went on to say that by 2050, we should be carbon neutral, which means that we're absorbing as much carbon as we're emitting. In other words, if we're emitting carbon through transportation or other sources, then we should be absorbing that carbon in either forests or other types of new technologies for absorbing carbon. So those are the timeframes that the scientists gave if we want to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees. We've already warmed 1 degree, and we are already seeing the impact of that as we've been discussing. So 1.5 may not sound like a lot more, but it would really, as these scientists found, it would make a critical difference. It would, to go above that level, for example, would mean that the coral reefs around the world would disappear because the oceans would just be too warm for corals to survive. So that means all of that habitat for all of those fish that live in coral reefs wouldn't exist anymore if we have temperatures rising above 1.5 degrees. So those are the kinds of timeframes that scientists are talking about, which is why I say it's really important to move forward with action now. And the government of Canada is, you may be aware, has put into place a whole series of measures to reduce emissions. We're going to start to see the impact of those measures in our emissions, and we've got to keep moving forward with that. We've got to make sure that we do all of the things that we can do, use all of the tools we have to reduce emissions as quickly as possible.
All right, and those timeframes, like you said, 11 years, that is not very far away at all. And for me personally, I've been scuba diving for over a decade now, and I've seen really healthy coral reefs, and they're incredible. But I've also seen coral reefs that have died, have bleached, and lost their color and life, and it's not great to see. So that is something that many students may not have experienced that before, and that's something that I hope my kids and everybody else's kids are able to experience, how beautiful a healthy ocean is. So definitely something to think about. One more trip to Brampton, Ontario. If you guys have a climate tip for us, we're all ears as well. We'd love to steal a question. So we're ready.
Show the water bottles, guys. Yoshi. Look at my water bottle.
For our class, we all use reusable water bottles, and our question is.
Okay, good. Okay. Go ahead, the question.
So our question is the third one. So, what do you think is the best policy in Canada that will truly change the course of global warming?
Okay, well, that's a great question because it allows me to talk a little bit about what we're doing. But just before I do that, I'll show you my reusable coffee cup. So this is what I use for drinking my coffee and tea every day. And I'm really glad to see your reusable water bottles. That's even better because water's healthier than coffee. But so what are we doing? Well, there's a couple of ways that governments can influence the amount of emissions that are put up into the air. And you know, one of the ways is to put in place regulations. Those are like rules. You know, when your parents say, these are the rules at home, you've got to keep your room clean. That's what governments do. We set rules, like, for example, saying that if you're going to generate electricity, you've got to be this efficient, and we'll put a number on that. And that's what we did around the coal burning for electricity. We said you've got to meet a certain level of emissions that it's impossible for coal right now to meet. So that means coal has to be phased out. So that's one way that governments do it. Another way is to provide incentives. So that's like when, you know, your parents will say, if you clean your room, we're going to give you extra allowance, you know. So governments will say to companies, you know, if you can reduce emissions by this amount, you know, we'll help you with that. We'll partner with you on projects that will reduce emissions. So for example, in Toronto, there was a project we supported that will generate clean energy for the city of Toronto. And then a third way is to put a price on emissions. So that would be like your parents saying, you know, if you don't clean your room, we're actually going to take money off your allowance, you know. So we're doing that too. We're putting a price on emissions so that for every ton of emissions that's emitted, it has a cost to it. So all of these measures have their role. Some work better in some places, like the coal rule, for example. Others, like putting a price on pollution, that has an impact across the economy, so it can get at all of the emissions that it's hard for governments to set rules on. So the bottom line is we really need to use all the tools to reduce emissions, because we have to move forward as fast as possible. And we have to work together on this as well. And the governments, we all have roles to play in this. We're collaborating together, for example, on rules around buildings. So how efficient should a building be? That's where the federal government puts in place a model building code, and then provinces can put that into regulation. They can make that a rule because they have that jurisdiction. So that's an example of where we set a rule that sets a floor. It means a new building has to be at a minimum level of efficiency. It can't be as inefficient as it is today. They have to be more efficient in the future. And you know what? They're going to be more comfortable too. That's the good thing about climate change action, is that the things we do to reduce emissions, they also almost always improve our quality of life. So if you think about living in a really energy efficient house, it's also going to be a really comfortable house. It's not going to be drafty. On those hot days, it's going to stay cooler without having to crank the air conditioning. So those are the kinds of things that we're doing.
All right. Well, Ambassador Fuller, first of all, thank you so much for taking some time from your day to hang out with our classrooms. Tell us a little bit about the awesome things that Canada is doing around climate change, also being that role model for other countries. And you know, throughout the years, throughout your career, you've been in this area a lot, the area of climate change. So thank you for your continued service to this issue, because it is such an important one and so important for this generation right now. So again, thank you so much for letting us steal some of your time. And it was really a pleasure to host you today.
Thank you so much, Joe. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for creating this opportunity for people to speak to classrooms. And for me, it's just been wonderful to have the chance to exchange with all of the classrooms that I've seen in the little boxes on my screen. And it's really been a pleasure to hear from all of you. Thank you.
All right. Well, one more shout out to Environment and Climate Change Canada. Thank you so much for the support for these events this month. And I'm going to turn on our microphones and let's get our classrooms a big shout out, a nice goodbye, and thank you for Ambassador Fuller. So here we go, classrooms, microphones. All right. They're always so good at that. They love to get loud. So again, thank you so much. Tune into more of our climate change events throughout the month. And again, Ambassador, thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day, and hopefully we can connect again in the future.
Thank you so much, Joe. Have a great day, everybody.